This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better. I'm David Karsten. 7 decades ago, Australia moved from working 6 days a week to 5. Many of us now think it's time for an update, with the idea of the 4-day workweek gaining traction around the world. A shorter workweek has been shown to boost productivity and mental health, but critics argue it's a white-collar fantasy that's unrealistic for many industries, such as healthcare, education and hospitality. And with us today to explore how the 4-day workweek could really work is Professor Julia Richardson. Julia is the head of the School of Management and Marketing at Curtin University and a recognised global expert in careers and human resources management. If you'd like to find out more about this topic, you can visit the links provided in the show notes. Julia, should we get the basic conceit of the 4-day working week clear first? It is not a 0.8 workload in 4 days. It is a full-time 5-day workload in 4 days, yes?
Yeah, so that's if it's a compressed work week. So you're compressing 5 days into 4 days, and expectations around work, what you would normally be expected to achieve in 5 days, you've now got to achieve it in 4 days.
When did this idea of the 4-day work week gain a bit of momentum?
Okay, so interestingly, it's not a new phenomenon. It actually first came out around the 1970s. In fact, last century, would you believe?
Can you imagine? It's positively ancient.
It is indeed. And so this was in the US around truck drivers delivering oil and gas around the US. So they compressed what was a 5-day work week into 4 days. And then it sort of died a little bit of an ebb. And then it really came up again in around 2008, a resurgence of popularity, and then went back down again, and then it really came about much more popular with regard to organisations and individuals looking for a 4-day work week just after COVID around 2020.
Oh, we all got a taste, didn't we?
Didn't we just?
At those different sort of peaks and troughs, were there different responses that were being garnered from those different periods of time, or was the response fairly similar across those different, I guess, experimental phases?
Yeah, pretty similar, although more recently, obviously, with the advent of technology and the extent to which an employer can monitor one's work performance much more stringently, I think now it has a different format and obviously different expectations. So I think with regard to surveillance or monitoring of work performance, and also there have been lots of changing expectations from employees as well in terms of what they're looking from their work experience.
Well, there are definitely two sides of the equation. What are the benefits of this 4-day week work arrangement for both employees and businesses?
Okay, so if we look at the employee, for example, it means that one can have a shorter work week. So obviously you're taking your Friday off, or you may in fact be taking your Monday off instead. So with respect to that, it can be very beneficial for the employee because they've got this shorter work week. They have more time to take care of personal responsibilities, not just family and caregiving, but also one's hobbies and interests and so forth. So that can be really helpful. I think also from an employer perspective, lots of different benefits. So, for example, it could be that this is a selling point when we're trying to recruit employees. We know that an increasing number of people want a 4-day work week, so it can be a significant selling point when you're trying to get people on board, trying to recruit the high caliber employees. So I think there are benefits for both parties.
I've been speaking with a colleague who has, in the last 12 months, switched to this arrangement, and she has noted a heightened sense of efficiency. Of course, she needs to be more efficient in her role in order to complete the workload within that 4-day period. But that is a good thing. She's I guess her observation was we tend to fill out and pace our workload according to how much time we have at our disposal. That's her observation. Is that a fair sort of observation across the board?
It is indeed a fair observation. So it's like with anything. Once you've got a new work arrangement or a new anything, then you're going to be much more self-aware. You're going to be much more observant about what you're actually doing. And you've also got that increased impetus to perform at a high level, precisely so that you don't lose this benefit. Because, of course, an employee is significantly aware that if they were to fall back on their performance, then the 4-day work week might well be taken away from and they're back to working 5 days. So you've got that additional incentive in order to hold on to that perk. So I think that's very, very important.
It's something that you also notice with parents of school-age children who are working to school hours and having been able to come to an arrangement with their employer. They really do have an efficiency about their approach. There's no mucking around. They come in and they know that I've got a deadline to meet, which is usually around 2:45 or whatever. It really is the sharper focus that you mentioned is definitely the case, isn't it?
Absolutely, because I think the important thing is you're very much aware that this is some flexibility, that you've reached an agreement with your employer.
It's a deal.
It's absolutely a deal. And in some respects, it's what we would call an ideal. An ideal.
I see what you did there.
Yeah, an ideal in the sense of, it's a deal that I have come to with my employer to have increased employability. And also there's what we would call a psychological contract, that I'm not going to let you down. You've bestowed some trust upon me to fulfill this new work arrangement, this new work design. So I think that's very important. We do know employees are very appreciative of these things. They're much more likely to stay on. They're less likely to, hand their notice in and go work for another employer. Specifically, if another employer, regardless of how much money they're getting, if the new employer is not actually going to give them this 4-day work week. So it's very much seen as an employment perk.
Time is precious, and what my colleague has also noted that outside of work in this arrangement, her mental well-being has improved. And that also her life is less dominated by work, and that has been a really welcome outcome. She's happier and lighter for it, but then on the flip side is more focused when she's at work.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because oftentimes what I might call our career identity or our broader sense of identity is dominated by work. So we see ourselves very much with respect to the place where we spend the vast majority of our working life. So if you have another dimension to your identity, another interest outside of work, then you're going to have a much richer life experience. And I think this is very, very important for employees. However, we do have to be careful with regard to the long-term implications of working longer hours if we've got this compressed work week. Can this be sustained over a long period of time? Because we know that it's much more intense. We know that you have to self-regulate much more. Can you sustain this over years? So we have to be very, very careful. And I think the important point here is that the employer has to come to the table. It's not just a set and forget. What support systems, what direction, what information can we give to employees in order to make it work?
In terms of that long-term sustainability, Julia, have there been longitudinal studies that are revealing certain outcomes?
Yes, very much so. So, for example, we know that the 4-day work week has been implemented in places like as far away as Iceland, the UK and Spain and New Zealand and so forth, as well as some employers in Australia. And what we do know that over time, it may well be that there could be problems further down the line, again, with respect to the implications for work-life balance, with respect to the intensity of work. So you're feeling much more exhausted because you're actually doing longer hours and you're not actually pacing yourself. And in some instances, that could be a reflection of a lack of support or a lack of frameworks, a lack of guidance from the employer.
Julia, the benefits seem very attractive, and you've highlighted, I guess, perhaps the flip side of that, the intensity required. But I think by and large, anyone offered this opportunity would most likely embrace it. Now, is this an opportunity that is feasible for all industries and all contexts of work?
Yeah, great question. And the simple answer is no, it isn't. So it depends very much on your business model. It also would be impacted, for example, who are your customers? Who are your clients? We know that this can be particularly problematic in what we're calling a 24/7 expectation for on-demand delivery of goods and services. So any business model has to take into account not just what the employees want, but actually what the clients or the customers or what their business model is. We do know some organisations are offering it, like professional service firms, for example, also in some sectors, for example, the retail sector. But it has to be a precise calculation on behalf of the employer to see whether or not it makes it work. So in terms of their stakeholders, they have to balance the needs of all their stakeholders precisely to make it work.
I'm sure there are listeners right now saying, look, this is a really great idea theoretically, but it actually doesn't even fit the type of industry or the type of role that I'm in as well. That's an issue with this theory, isn't it?
That is, and that is absolutely, and it's very much like, for example, with the idea of working from home and other flexible work practices. The point is that not all jobs can be done from the home space. Some can, some cannot. So we have to be very careful, I think, in terms of establishing the expectation of the employee. If you've got a lot of client, in-person, face-to-face work, then obviously working from home is simply not going to be able to be available for you. But then again, that's about having a conversation with your employer about what is actually going to work, because at the end of the day, the employer and the employee have to make sure that work is done in the way that is required to be done.
Where some industries and organisations are able to embrace this, there are business groups that are saying, and you talked about this being an ideal earlier, that this 4-day work week is a populist bubble, and that workers want to have their cake and eat it too. What are your thoughts on that? Is it as an ideal, is it flawed?
I think we have to be really careful, because previously, when we went down from the 6-day a week work to the 5 days, that could have been characterised in the same way. I think that what is happening, and this has been happening over many, many years, is the point is that worker expectations are changing, and the idea that the worker simply has to comply with everything that the employer demands, those days have gone. So now, again, it's about a negotiation. And I certainly think that employers need to be open to the idea of change. But of course, in some instances, the employee cannot simply have everything they want. They have to meet those performance targets. That's very, very important. And I think also to make sure there's a clear understanding of what the expectations are. And what's really interesting, I think you need to be really careful as an employee. In some instances, we know this has happened when employees have requested to work from home. What is the perception of the employer? So somebody who wanted a 4-day work week, might they be perceived of not taking their work seriously?
Right.
Are you as committed because you actually now only want to work 4 days rather than 5 days? So it's about managing one's own professional image, one's brand image, and making sure that you're really on the ball, that you are meeting those performance expectations.
Read the room and really think through the optics.
Very much so. And there are other issues as well with regard to the 4-day work week. So, for example, what are the implications for one's career trajectory? How are you going to be viewed? When are you going to be within the office space? If you're taking Fridays off, for example, and all the really important decisions are made on Friday, maybe you need to reevaluate how you're organising your work.
Yeah, that's a very fair statement to make. But there could be some flexibility in there also. Does your 4-day a week have to include a Friday off?
Absolutely.
Maybe as an employee, you have to offer up some flexibility in this arrangement as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. So, for example, traditionally you might say, sure, I'm going to take Fridays off, but we know that many people, for example, would prefer to take the Monday off, or other employees are preferring to take the Wednesday off. So it's about that flexibility. And the key question, again, is what is going to suit the employer and the work requirements, but also factor in what preferences do the employee have as well.
Well, the employees will probably say, well, if I'm getting the work done, if it's simply a case of actually getting the work done, and we look back and review after 12 months, and that is the case, then it's maybe time to have a conversation about what productivity actually means, especially in this shorter work week sort of context. I mean, has our idea of productivity changed? And, is this an opportunity for us to reset work design and also take into consideration AI as a means of enabling a shorter working week?
Yeah, I think so. So there are two things, and I'm going to come back to an earlier point. There are two things there. We know with regard to work performance, now with technological development, we know it's much easier to monitor work and performance. So that's where technology comes in terms of measuring performance outputs. And I think organizations have become much more astute at deciding what are the performance expectations here, and importantly, how are we going to measure it? But from an employee's perspective, and we do know this with regard to much research about careers and career development, it's not just performance that will impact on our professional opportunities, on promotions. Performance, of course, is very, very important, but it's not the only thing. It's the other things that we bring to work. So, for example, collegiality, support for colleagues, buying into the mission of the organization. So I think it's incumbent upon employees, particularly if they have particularly high career goals, if they're very ambitious, that performance is simply one dimension of how we're evaluated.
That idea of evaluation and quantifying, I guess it's a little difficult to apply that to collegiality, but it is tangible, isn't it?
It is tangible, and I think the other important thing is it's observable. So one's colleagues, one's manager is actually observing how we interact in the workplace and the extent to which that makes us appointable or not appointable for a higher position or for a leadership or another managerial position. So I think the work experience and performance and productivity is way above sort of simply widgets and productivity, right? It's a much richer dynamic I think it's important to navigate and be aware of.
I guess any framework or structure that involves people is in itself a community, as different as that might be defined in those different contexts, but it is a community.
It is. It's very much a community. And what we do know from organisations in research done, for example, looking for what do employers want. Yes, employers do want those, for want of a better word, technical skills and the capacity to use AI or technological advances or appliances or whatever. But we also know that what is critical for employers is the extent to which somebody has very highly skilled interpersonal skills. That is absolutely critical for any employer.
Yeah, when you think about it and devote a bit of reflection to it, you do realise that one personality, or each personality within an organisation, affects the dynamic of that organisation in their own way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you have a very positive personality, for example, what we might call positive affect, you're friendly, you're collegial, you're supportive, then if we reflect back on things like working from home or that 4-day work week, you're much more likely to be able to make it work and to work collegially with your employer, with your clients, with your customers, as well as with your colleagues.
I know you've touched on it in a previous answer, but can we unpack the AI side of the equation a little more? As you've seen AI or generative AI become more prevalent, have you been looking upon it as a bit of an opportunity perhaps to, I guess, benefit organisations and employees in the context of a 4-day working week?
Yeah, very much so. We know that, there are conversations around how can we best use AI, and I think certainly it does provide us with some opportunities, perhaps to work more efficiently, to take away some of what one might call the drudge work away from employees so they can focus on other activities. So I think there's a balance here. I think we have to be cautious in saying that human beings aren't going to be needed ever again, and we have to be careful to steer away from hyperbole here. So just as some activities can now be undertaken by AI, obviously now the workforce is changing. Customer and client expectations are changing. Maybe they would prefer to talk to a human being rather than an AI device. So I think there are opportunities for other work activities that we can undertake. So I think we should go into using AI with some caution, but also with some realism.
Well, I guess the flip side there would be an employee concerned about job preservation. I mean, is a shorter working week, I guess, adding fuel to the fire that we're possibly doing ourselves out of a job in conjunction with the advent of AI?
Yeah, I think we have to be careful around that also, the idea of making oneself indispensable. And that, I think, relates to what we would call skill transferability. And this idea of having a little bit cliched perhaps, but a growth mindset. So rather than sitting with our arms folded saying, bah, humbug, this sort of AI, this technological development, it's all awful. It's about how do we engage with technology? How do we engage with the challenges that we're facing so that we can make a contribution to the workplace, to our clients, to our employer, and at a larger scale to society as well.
We might all do different jobs, Julia, but relevance applies to all of us, right?
Absolutely, and I think that's an important point. It's about keeping ourselves relevant and informed, and also drawing on those support structures from educators, from our employers, to see how I can continue to be relevant and to make a contribution.
Julia, at a policy level, the federal government is saying that it has no current plans to implement a 4-day working week. But if a business wanted to trial this arrangement, what steps should they take?
Okay. So the first thing that I would advise that they would do, they'd look elsewhere. And they look at for example, some best case examples about what have other organisations done, and specifically how have they implemented this opportunity. And again, it's moving away from that set and forget. Don't leave employees stranded, simply saying to them, okay, off you go on your 4-day work week. It's up to you to figure it out. It's about how do we introduce it? Perhaps, for example, introducing it at a staged level. It may be available initially just to one group of employees. Trialling it there, if there are any challenges emerging, let's make some tweaks to it before we roll it out to the rest of the organisation. So I think it's important to do it at an incremental level so that any learning opportunities, they come early, they can fail fast, make the adjustments, and then make it work before we roll it out to a large proportion of employees. And also, I think you have to have those ongoing support structures. If it's not working for a particular employee or for a particular group of employees, don't just simply remove it from them and say, it's not working for you, you're back in 5 days a week. What was wrong? What went wrong here? How can we make put those checks and balances in? What adjustments do we need to make precisely in order to make it work? So it's about an ongoing learning process so that you've got all stakeholders working together and doing some checks perhaps after 3 months, after 6 months, after a year to see what's not working, rather than simply casting it aside and saying this doesn't work for us. And it's being able to make that call early to decide which additional support structures are required.
The colleague I mentioned earlier was very quick to let me know that her arrangement is, it's a 4-day working week, but if the workload or if a crisis needs to be managed or if something comes up on her day off, she is still obligated to meet that. It's very much an understanding between her and her employer to pivot and meet the needs as required.
I think that's a really important point, because it's about setting the expectations that these are the performance requirements. This is what we expect you to achieve. So the 4-day work week is going in parallel with that. But if something happens and you're not meeting those KPIs, then we need to have a conversation about any changes. And it's exactly the same as when, for example, an employee starts to work from home a couple of days a week, or if they continue to work from home 5 days a week. Again, it's about identifying what are the key performance indicators, how much support do employees need in order to achieve them.
When an organisation is looking to do that research and look at other organisations, are you suggesting that perhaps they look within their own country for other examples because of, quite country-specific issues like employment law, that sort of thing?
Very much so, yeah. So what I would recommend that, first of all, they look within country or perhaps within a region, see what's happened. Let's have a look and see what other organisations have done, and organisations that are quite similar to our organisation. So, of course, we know it may be different across industries, across organisations. It depends very much, for example, on organisational cultures. I think it helps us also if we start looking beyond our own shores to other countries and see what's works and what hasn't worked. I think it's important. What can we learn from how others have achieved this, or what problems have they encountered, what checks and balances, and then looking at how can we adjust that to our own specific context. And also there's national culture as well. There's things like, for example, family arrangements. How are houses structured? Are we in a culture where we have extended families living together? How might that impact on productivity if somebody's working from the home and so forth? So I think the important point here is that it's multidimensional.
There's so many considerations there, Julia, but I guess the biggest question I've left till last, and are you prepared for this?
Mm-hmm.
How many days a week do you work, Julia?
I work a good solid 5 days a week.
All has been revealed, ladies and gentlemen, but it's a role that requires that sort of intensity.
It does indeed. It does.
Well, Julia, we really appreciate the time that you've given us today to expound some of your research and findings of many years of experience in this area. It's an exciting frontier, and it's a time of great change, and we really appreciate your insights today. Thank you.
You are most welcome. Thank you.
You've been listening to The Future Of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it. And if you want to hear more from experts, stay up to date by subscribing to us on your favourite podcast app. Bye for now.